We can't wait any longer. Look at the time. We should head back to the car now.
Grief is supposed to be a private thing. It's supposed to be a time where the world stops so you can breathe. But when you are sitting on an empire, grief is a luxury you can't afford. The funeral was a performance. I stood at the edge of the grave, the rain soaking through my expensive wool coat, watching two mahogany caskets disappear into the dirt. I felt like I was watching my own life being buried. Around me there were hundreds of people. Men in black suits who worked for my father, women in veils who had tea with my mother. They all shook my hand. They all said the same empty words. They were great people, and if you need anything, just call. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my Uncle Marcus and Aunt Sarah. They weren't looking at the caskets. They were looking at the estate lawyer. They were whispering in the back of the black limousine while the priest was still speaking. They weren't mourning a brother or a sister-in-law. They were counting the silverware in their heads. The betrayal didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a signature. 3 days after the funeral, I was sitting in the library. The house felt like a tomb. It was too quiet, too cold. I was waiting for the lawyer to come and tell me what the next steps were. I assumed there was a will. I assumed I was the sole heir. I was 18, I thought the law was a shield. Uncle Marcus walked in first. He didn't knock. He didn't have that sad uncle face anymore. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery and was trying to stay calm. He sat in my father's chair. "We need to talk about the future, son," he said. He didn't call me by my name. He called me son, like it was a patronizing label. Aunt Sarah walked in behind him, carrying a stack of papers. She started walking around the room, touching the vases, checking the brand of the piano. She looked like she was already redecorating. The lawyer arrived, but he didn't look me in the eye. He looked at Marcus. "There's a problem with the estate," the lawyer said, his voice flat and professional. "Your father's latest business venture. It was highly leveraged. There are debts. Massive debts. And because the primary accounts were tied to his personal signature, the banks have frozen everything." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Uncle Marcus said, leaning forward, "that this house, the cars, the accounts, they aren't yours. They belong to the creditors. But because we are family, Sarah and I have stepped in. We've used our own money to settle the immediate debts to keep the family name out of the mud." I felt a spark of hope. "Thank you, Uncle. I didn't know." He cut me off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Don't thank me yet. To settle those debts, we had to take ownership of the assets. It was the only way the bank would agree. Legally, the estate now belongs to the Marcus and Sarah Trust. We are the owners. You are a guest." The room started to spin. They had used the 3 days I spent crying to move pieces on a chessboard I didn't even know existed. They had used my father's business debts, which I later found out were exaggerated or fabricated, to swoop in as saviors. "You can stay in the guest wing for a week," Aunt Sarah said, not even looking up from a clipboard. "But after that, we're listing the property. It's too much overhead. You understand, don't you? It's just business." "A week," I whispered. "This is my home." "It was your home," Marcus corrected. "Now it's an asset. And you? You have no income, no degree, and no experience. You're a liability." I looked at the lawyer. "Is this legal? Can they do this?" The lawyer finally looked at me. There was no pity in his eyes, only the cold reality of a man who had been paid more by Marcus than my father had ever paid him. "The paperwork is in order. You signed the temporary guardianship and asset management forms the night of the accident." My heart stopped. The night of the accident. When I was in shock. When my eyes were blurred with tears. Marcus had put a pen in my hand and told me it was just some forms to help with the funeral. I had signed my own death warrant because I trusted the people who shared my blood. The next few days were a nightmare of humiliation. I watched movers come in and take my mother's jewelry. I watched them drive my father's cars out of the garage. Every time I tried to speak up, Marcus would remind me that I was living on his charity. They didn't just take the money. They took my dignity. They made me eat in the kitchen with the staff. They told the servants not to listen to me anymore. On the 7th day, I came downstairs to find 2 suitcases sitting by the front door. My clothes were inside, not the expensive suits but the jeans and t-shirts. "The car is waiting to take you to the city," Sarah said. She was wearing my mother's favorite diamond necklace. She didn't even try to hide it. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. "You're a young man," Marcus said, walking over and handing me a crisp $100 bill. It was a final insult. A tip for the boy who used to own the house. Go make something of yourself. Use that heritage you're always talking about. If you're really your father's son, you'll be fine. If not, well, the world needs ditch diggers too. The guards, men who used to open the door for me with a smile, now escorted me out. They didn't look at me. They looked at the ground. As the gates closed, I didn't look back at the house. I looked at Marcus and Sarah standing on the balcony, glass of champagne in their hands, looking down at me like I was a piece of trash the wind had finally blown away. They thought they had won. They thought they had taken everything. But as I stood on the sidewalk with $100 and 2 suitcases, I realized they had made a mistake. They left me with the one thing they couldn't put in a trust or sell at an auction. They left me with the truth. I knew their faces. I knew their greed. And I knew that from this moment on, I wasn't a prince. I wasn't an orphan. I was a ghost. And I was going to haunt them until they begged me to take it all back. The first thing you learn about the world when you have no money is that it is incredibly loud. When you're rich, the world is muffled. You're behind double-pane glass, inside climate-controlled rooms, or in the back of silent cars. But on the street, everything screams at you. The tires on the wet pavement, the sirens 3 blocks away, the shouting of people who are just as desperate as you are. That first night in the city was the longest night of my life. I stood at the bus station with my 2 suitcases, watching the bus that brought me here pull away. The exhaust fumes hit me in the face, a sharp, stinging smell that replaced the scent of expensive cologne and lavender my mother used to keep in the house. I had $100 in my pocket. In my old life, $100 was a tip for a waiter. Now it was my entire lifeline. It was the only thing standing between me and the abyss. I didn't know where to go. I had never booked a hotel for myself. I had never even walked through a bad neighborhood. I walked until my arms ached from carrying the bags. I found a cheap motel on the edge of the industrial district. The sign flickered with a hum that made my teeth ache. The man behind the desk didn't look at me. He looked at my shoes. They were handcrafted Italian leather, the last remnants of my old life. $40, he said. For the night. I asked. For 12 hours, he grunted. Pay up or move on. I paid. I walked into a room that smelled like old cigarettes and bleach. The bed was thin, the sheets felt like sandpaper, and the walls were so thin I could hear the man in the next room coughing. I sat on the edge of that bed and realized I had just spent nearly half of my net worth on 12 hours of safety. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time the building creaked, I thought it was someone coming to take the rest. The next morning, I walked out into the cold air. I realized I couldn't afford another night at the motel. I had $60 left. I had to eat. I had to find work. But more than that, I had to find a place to hide. I spent the day walking. I saw the city for the first time, not as a playground, but as a machine. I saw thousands of people rushing to jobs they hated, all of them moving with a frantic energy because they were all terrified of ending up exactly where I was. I ended up at a homeless shelter by evening. The line was a mile long. I saw men with gray skin and hollow eyes. They looked like ghosts. I realized with a jolt of terror that if I stayed in that line, I would become one of them. I walked away. I chose a concrete loading dock behind a warehouse instead. It was cold, it was hard, and it was humiliating. But it was private. I pulled my expensive wool coat tight around me and lay down on the cold ground. The concrete sucks the heat right out of your bones. It doesn't matter how many layers you wear, the ground is a thief. It steals your warmth, your pride, and your hope. That was the bottom. I lay there looking up at the stars, but I couldn't see them because of the city lights. I thought about my Uncle Marcus. I thought about him lying in a silk-sheeted bed that belonged to my father. I thought about Aunt Sarah drinking wine from my mother's crystal glasses. A few days ago, that thought would have made me cry. But that night on the concrete, something shifted. The grief was gone. It had been frozen out of me. I realized that the prince was a fairy tale. The prince was a boy who relied on other people's strength. The prince was the one who signed the papers because he was too weak to read them. I needed to kill that boy. I sat up. My back popped. My hands were dirty. My shoes were scuffed. I looked at my hands in the dim light of a street lamp. They were trembling not from cold but from a new kind of energy. I understood the first rule of the shadows. When you have nothing, you have the advantage of being invisible. Marcus and Sarah thought I was a spoiled kid who would starve or break within a week. They expected me to come crawling back, begging for a handout, which they would then use to make me sign away even more of my soul. But as I sat on that concrete bed, I made a silent vow to the city. I wouldn't go back. Not as a nephew. Not as a beggar. I began to analyze the warehouse I was sleeping behind. I watched the trucks come in. I watched the security guards' routine. I noticed that the guards spent 20 minutes every hour in the break room. I noticed that the delivery drivers often left their manifests on the dash of the unlocked trucks. I realized that while I was at the bottom, I was in the perfect position to see the cracks in the world. The rich are so busy looking at the horizon that they never look at their feet. And I was right there at their feet watching everything. I didn't need a mansion to be powerful. I needed information. I needed a plan. And most of all, I needed to wait. I spent that night and the next 3 weeks in the shadows. I learned how to stay clean using a sink in a gas station. I learned how to make $5 last 2 days. I learned how to walk through a crowd without being seen. I was no longer the prince of the estate. I was becoming something else. I was becoming a student of the grind. The concrete bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a forge. It was where the soft, entitled parts of my soul were burned away, leaving only the hard, sharp steel underneath. Marcus thought he took my inheritance. He was wrong. He took the distractions. He left me with the only thing that actually matters, the hunger to take it all back. The hardest part about being at the bottom isn't the hunger. It's the lack of a name. When I lived in the mansion, I was the heir. When I was on the street, I was the vagrant. But to get back to the top, I had to become something even more powerful, the ghost. I realized quickly that I couldn't get a high-level job. I had no ID, no references, and a gap in my life that looked like a black hole. So, I went where the invisible people go. I went to the cleaning agencies. The ones that send crews into the massive skyscrapers at 2 a.m. when the important people are sleeping. I got a job with a crew cleaning the very district my father used to dominate. My first night, I was handed a gray jumpsuit and a mop. I looked at the reflection in the glass of a high-rise lobby. I didn't recognize myself. The prince was gone. In his place was a worker with a number and a bucket. But as I pushed that mop across the marble floors exactly like the ones in my childhood home, I realized something that Marcus and Sarah would never understand. People talk in front of the help. They treat janitors, waiters, and security guards like furniture. They think because you are cleaning their trash, you don't have a brain. They have loud conversations about mergers, they leave sensitive memos on their desks, and they throw away the very leverage they think they've hidden. I started at the bottom of a firm called Vanguard Holdings. They were one of the companies my uncle Marcus was trying to partner with using my father's stolen capital. Every night, while the rest of the crew was complaining about the pay or the hours, I was reading. I would empty an executive's trash can, but I would look at the shredded papers first. I would clean a glass desk, but I would memorize the names on the sticky notes. I learned more about business in 6 months of cleaning offices than I did in 18 years of living in a mansion. I learned who was sleeping with whom. I learned who was embezzling. I learned which companies were actually drowning in debt while pretending to be successful. I was collecting bullets for a gun I hadn't built yet. I lived on nothing. I slept in a tiny shared room in a basement that cost me a quarter of my paycheck. I ate eggs and rice. I saved every single cent. My hands, which used to be soft and manicured, were now calloused and scarred from industrial chemicals. But my mind was becoming a weapon. I remember one night I was buffing the floor in a corner office on the 42nd floor. It was the CEO's office. He had stayed late and he was on a speakerphone call. He didn't even look up when I entered. He didn't pause his conversation. He was talking about a weak link in a new deal. He mentioned a name, Marcus. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands stayed steady on the mop. I didn't stop. I didn't flinch. I just kept moving the wax back and forth, listening to every word. He said Marcus was desperate to prove himself and was overextending his credit to buy a failing tech firm. He called my uncle a clown in a dead man's suit. I almost smiled. That night, I realized that the forge was working. If I had been the prince, I would have burst in or called him. But as the invisible laborer, I just finished the floor, emptied his trash, and walked out with a piece of information that was worth millions. I started a notebook. I kept it hidden under the floorboards of my basement room. In it, I mapped out the entire financial web of the city. I knew who was vulnerable. I knew who was greedy. And I knew exactly where Marcus was making his mistakes. The grind isn't just about working hard. Anyone can work hard. The grind is about suffering with a purpose. While Marcus was busy going to galas and bragging about his new wealth, I was in the shadows, literally cleaning up the mess of the world he wanted to belong to. He was playing at being a king. I was learning how to be the person who decides who gets to keep the crown. I stayed in that gray jumpsuit for a year. I watched the seasons change through the floor-to-ceiling windows of offices I wasn't allowed to sit in. I felt the sting of being ignored by people who weren't half as smart as I was. But every time a billionaire looked through me like I was a pane of glass, I whispered to myself, "Keep looking through me, because by the time you finally see me, I'll own the air you're breathing." I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was an architect. And my labor wasn't cleaning floors, it was building a trap. There is a moment when you're at the bottom where you have a choice. You can either let the weight of the world crush you until you're just another bitter soul, or you can realize that the weight is actually a tool. For a long time, I woke up angry. I woke up thinking about my parents' accident, the smell of my aunt's perfume as she stole my mother's jewelry, and the way the gates of my own home slammed shut. But anger is an amateur's emotion. It's loud, it's hot, and it burns out too fast. The psychological pivot happened on a Tuesday night. I was sitting in my basement room eating a cold can of beans, looking at my notebook. I realized I was still thinking like a victim. I was thinking, they took my money. They are in my house. I had to stop that. I had to realize that the money was gone. The house was gone. The boy who lived there was dead. I looked at my calloused hands. They weren't dirty anymore. They were seasoned. I realized that Marcus and Sarah were actually in a much weaker position than I was. Why? Because they were afraid. They were afraid of losing what they had stolen. They were afraid of what people thought of them. They were addicted to the luxury I used to take for granted. But me? I had already faced the worst thing that could happen. I had slept on concrete. I had been ignored. I had survived on $5 a day. I was no longer afraid of anything. And a man who has nothing to lose is the most dangerous predator on the planet. I decided to stop being a janitor who used to be a prince and started being an investor who was currently a janitor. It sounds like a small shift, but it changed everything. I stopped looking at the executives in the buildings I cleaned with envy. I started looking at them with pity. I saw their stress. I saw how they were slaves to their bank accounts. I saw how easily they could be manipulated by their own greed. I realized that wealth isn't about how much you have in your pocket. It's about how much you control in your mind. Marcus had the assets, but I had the logic. He was playing a game of checkers, trying to look big in my father's suits. I was playing a game of chess, and I hadn't even moved a pawn yet. I started practicing the law of emotional detachment. Whenever I saw my uncle's name in a news article or heard a CEO mention him, my heart used to race. Now I forced it to stay still. I treated him like a math problem, a variable that needed to be solved. I stopped spending money on anything that wasn't a tool for my return. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. I realized that my year in the shadows was actually a PhD in human nature. Most people spend their whole lives trying to get into the rooms I was cleaning. I was already in the room. I was the invisible man. I began to understand that power is a shadow play. If you control the light, you control the shadow. I spent my nights studying. Not just my notebook, but psychology books I found in used bookstores. I studied how to read body language. I studied how to spot a lie. I studied how to make people trust you by saying almost nothing. I was building a dark capital. I had a map of every secret, every debt, and every ego in the city. I knew that Marcus was buying a tech company that was about to collapse. I knew he was doing it because he wanted to be seen as a visionary. His ego was his blind spot. And the first rule of the sage is, Target the blind spot. I wasn't a boy anymore. The soft edges were gone. My voice had become deeper, quieter. I didn't need to shout to be heard because I only spoke when I had something to win. I looked in the cracked mirror of my basement room. I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who was ready. The forge was finished. The steel was tempered. I had moved from, "Why did this happen to me?" to, "How can I use this to destroy them?" Marcus and Sarah thought they had buried me. They didn't realize I was a seed, and I was about to break through the surface in a way they would never see coming. The prince was officially dead. The Nightfire Sage had taken his place. Message from Mr. Sage.
The true measure of a life well lived isn't found in the years you accumulate, but in the quiet moments you truly inhabit.